Thank you for joining us for our broadcast, Exploring Implicit Bias in the History Social Science Classroom. My name is Michelle Herzog. I'm the History Social Science Coordinator 3 for the Los Angeles County Office of Education, and happy to bring this three-part series to you. Right now we're in Module 2 on developing mindsets, skill sets, and exploring bias. Part 3 of this module is what we're going to enter into now with my good friend Sandra Line. It's about addressing difficult discussions in the classroom. We have already spent time in Part 1 with an overview in this module and developing positive mindsets. Part 2 focused on developing skill sets, which are of course equally important in classrooms. Here we are in Part 3, and following this is Part 4, which is about navigating difficult conversations about ethnic studies with adults or community members or even our own colleagues at our school sites. So I'm happy to re-invite my good friend and colleague, Sandra Line, who's had extensive experience in classroom settings in Los Angeles Unified School District, is a mentor, teacher leader, presenter, all things. We're just so privileged to know and work with you. So thank you, Sandy, for taking us through these. And now, again, with Part 3.
Okay, we talked in Part 1 about developing positive mindset and what influences positive mindsets. We talked about teachers, communities, and students and how they all bring their background to the classroom. In Part 2, we talked about developing skill sets, especially developing questioning techniques so that students would be able to ask questions, feel comfortable in the classroom. Part 3 is talking about the difficult conversations that you can have in a classroom and how to set it up and provide for a meaningful discussion so the students are able to ask questions and have a discussion and feel supported and not leave your classroom unhappy. So what we're going to do, first of all, is take a look at this survey from the Anti-Defamation League. This is a wonderful survey that you can use to address yourself or your school or your classroom. Asking yourself questions, do I do this for the students? Or does my school provide this service for the students? And it's a good way to identify what you need to know about your students so you can talk about identity and you can talk about justice, and then think about what tools are needed for difficult conversations. But doing this survey first kind of gives you a feel for the next steps that you need to take. One of the things that when you're thinking about having the conversation in the classroom, there are some things that we say, no, we can't talk about that. What holds you back? What holds your students back? And if these are issues that you are concerned with, what are the tools that you need? And then how do we disrupt the single perspective? As history social scientists, we know that frequently a textbook will have just one perspective. So what we want to do in ethnic studies is we want to make sure that all of our students are included in that story. So what are the tools that we're going to use to make sure that they are included? And so those are some of the things we need to think about. So another factor that you need to think about when you're teaching ethnic studies is the community and the tenor of the community. Is the course being taught in a district where parents or the community are unfamiliar with this field? If you were to suddenly say, we're offering a class in ethnic studies, and they want to know, well, why are we doing this? Why aren't we doing something else? That may provide an adversarial situation for you as a teacher. So you need to be aware of that. Secondly, are you in a school where there's a widening opportunity gap? Are there students of a particular ethnicity getting more advantage than students of another ethnicity, which can cause all sorts of conflict? Then we want to know how students are explicitly able to talk about race and ethnicity. Are they comfortable? Some students are, some students absolutely no. And then is the course being taught during a moment where there's been a racial incident at school? Sometimes, all of a sudden, if there is an incident at school, people will say, well, we've got to have this class. This will make everything okay. It'll smooth things over. The kids will be able to talk to one another and we won't have those problems. But these are factors that you need to think about when you're presenting your ethnic studies class and your ethnic studies curriculum.
And being sensitive to all those
Absolutely.
areas, thinking about age appropriateness of certain topics. We talked previously, too, about sometimes ethnic studies will reveal some events of the past that were traumatic. Do we want to revisit those, not knowing if some of our students have gone through traumatic experience? You don't want them to relive things. It's a lot of things to think about before you enter the topics.
Absolutely. Or if you want to go over it with them, how do you present it in a way that does not upset them? We don't want to ignore what's happened, but we want to be able to talk about it. One of the things that would have been a really difficult topic would be talking about the George Floyd killing. You know, that is something that could bring up all sorts of other conversation. So the way you would present that kind of a conversation, that difficult question, is the teacher has to be very cognizant of the students. And we talked about that in part 1, about knowing your students and their backgrounds and so forth. All of those things come together when we're talking about difficult questions. So these are some of the topics that are addressed in the Ethnic Studies Guide that deal with the area of history and movement. And so they could be questions that you use in your ethnic studies curriculum that could provide a starting point for a difficult conversation. For example, how does migration affect identities of individuals, communities, and nations? Certainly, the U.S. this is something that the U.S. is thinking about a lot. There's been a lot of pushback on people coming to this country. So we want to think about what were the push-pull factors? What pushed a group of people away from their homes? I mean, everybody wants to stay in their home with their families, what they're familiar with. But maybe it's drought, maybe it's famine, maybe it's war, maybe it's an oppressive government that they feel like, I just can't do it anymore. That's a push factor. But then there are pull factors. If you have family in another place and you want to be with that family, that's a pull factor. Or there's an opportunity for a job that you normally would not have. That's a pull factor. But those are things that you have to think about when you think about these questions.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's really important to take a look at these questions that have been provided in the Ethnic Studies curriculum and see how you can use them and weave them into your study. This is a really interesting graphic about the area of history and movement. And you'll notice that in the early part, towards the Civil War, after the Civil War, there were certain areas of the world where our immigrants came from. And as we move further into the 20th century, we have people coming from other areas. And so we need to be aware of what are the things that push them this way, what are the things that pull them this way, and how have they been incorporated into our society, and what are the things that we can learn from them or share with other people. One of the great things I think about living in California is the fact that we are so diverse. I love hearing different languages. Think about all the different foods we have been exposed to that we normally would not have been exposed to if we had lived in an area that was very isolated. I mean, we have just been enriched by the migration that has come to us. Another thing is to think about systems of power. How does society divide people into groups? Wow, that's really critical right now.
Formally and informally.
Absolutely. And what is the relationship between individual power and collective power?
Yes.
One of the things that you can talk about in collective power is you can talk about the union movement. And why was the union movement so good? And the union movement really helped newcomers to this country achieve a lifestyle that they wanted. So that would be something to think about. And what are the implications for society that when it categorizes people into a social hierarchy? We have documents that say all men are created equal. But in reality, we don't treat everybody equally. So what is the system that has put people into a social hierarchy that some people feel that they are better than others, or some people act as though they can treat other people in an unfriendly manner?
And it goes beyond ethnicity, too.
Oh, absolutely
I mean,
it does.
Groups are divided, categorized by
Oh, economically?
Economically,
Yes.
religion,
Absolutely.
gender orientation, sexual orientation, all of
Areas of
that.
the country.
Yes.
You know, the middle part of our country is always talking about the coastal elites, you know, and that is kind of like, where did that come from? Why do people feel that way? But those are things that we need to think about when we're talking about this. Another thing is that we need to talk about, especially in ethnic studies, and this is one of the 8 major features of ethnic studies, is talking about identity. How do our identities influence our choices or provide the choices that are available to us?
Yes.
What factors influence our identity and in turn the choices that we make? And how is identity shaped and reshaped by specific circumstances? Does your identity change as an immigrant as you live here longer? Does your identity change for the better? Does it change not for the better? What happens? I mean, what are the experiences that you have that change you as a person? Because all of us change our identities from the day
Right.
that we were born. You know, we become different people as we grow and go through different circumstances.
experiences.
Yes.
Yes.
And then just add on top of that, if you are an immigrant, the outside influences that also affect you. So those are all things that we need to talk about. So identity becomes very, very complex, and we need to look at all of the different factors of identity. And when we talked about this in part 1, and we talked about the different areas of culture that we needed to look at, that is where we get our identity.
Yes.
We need to talk about race and ethnicity. Are they interchangeable, or are they really two distinct concepts? Sometimes people use those words as though they mean the same thing. So we have to talk about that, and we need to think about how are the concepts of race like whiteness or blackness constructed. Those are really hot button issues. And so those are things that can come up in a classroom that make difficult discussions really important in the class. So one of the things, again, I'm revisiting the iceberg, but one of the things, again, is to talk to students about what's visible about them, what's invisible about them. And you can base it on race, you can base it on ethnicity, you could base it on culture, but just to get the kids to think about it a little more deeply, because it will prepare them perhaps for the difficult discussions.
So you've touched on some very important aspects to consider when we're approaching these topics. It's a lot to think about before we even enter into the discussions, right? But can you share a few tips for classrooms that help teachers? We like the practical.
Absolutely. First of all, let's talk about what you can use in the classroom. And what I love about this illustration is, look at these are groups of 4 and 6. And we've talked about the importance of students
Small
facing
group.
each other so that they can talk to each other, they can support each other, and where everybody's opinion is respected. But first of all, we have to establish classroom norms.
Absolutely.
And as teachers, we all know about classroom norms. Sometimes they are as simple as be on time to class, respect each other, turn in your homework. But with ethnic studies, we need more specific norms. We need to establish community agreements so that everybody knows they're going to be heard. We have to talk about empathetic listening so that I just don't dismiss what you say because I just have no empathy for you. We have to talk about how conflicting views are valued. So if you say something that is totally an anathema to me, I'm not going to just fly off the handle and say, Michelle, that's crazy. But I need to listen to learn and then have a time for reflection and debrief. One of the things you don't want to do is when you have these difficult discussions, the discussion suddenly ends and you say, okay, see you all tomorrow, because there are a lot of issues that have not been resolved. So we're going to talk about that. So we need to have established these classroom norms. And this graphic talks about some of the things you want to include in your norms for your ethnic studies. This is critical. Then you need to take a look at your classroom. And we talked about that in part 1 about, is your classroom welcoming? But is your classroom set up for conversation? Students should be able to see each other's faces. You don't want a comment to come from a student and the other people can't see their face, because body language tells you a lot. And so students should be able to see the person who's speaking so they can truly see to understand. And then are there guidelines and norms before you begin the conversation? And those need to be revisited. Like, remember, these are the norms for our classroom, empathetic listening.
Yes.
We're going to debrief. We're going to value everybody's
Yes.
opinion. That's critical.
Well, and it's nice to engage students in creating the norms too,
Absolutely.
right? That it's not just, here's the chart,
No.
here's where we're going.
That's exactly right. And when you're building community, that's when you build these norms together with the students. Now, some students may not know how to do this as a community. That's where the teacher can help them
Absolutely.
to determine what the norms
Absolutely.
are. And students who have built their own norms, stick to them because they created them.
Yes, they're
And so-
more invested in
Absolutely.
it. We know this, of course.
Then
Talk
you-
about goals.
All right. What is
Goal
the goal
setting.
for this conversation? Is this a conversation that deals with a specific situation that's happened at school that we need to address? Or is this something that has come out of the ethnic studies curriculum? So if you're talking about, let's say, migration and movement, what is the goal? Is the goal to show that there are other groups that also had the same reasons for moving, had the same experience when they got here, so that they can see commonalities? But you want to have an idea of where you're headed, not necessarily just open-ended discussion.
Right.
Then you need to have a compelling question. Michael talked about building
Yes,
a
we
question.
spent a lot of time talking
And
about
that's
that.
really an important issue. So you might want to share a starting point with the students and also provide the students with question starters, perhaps, or
Oh, that's
clarifying
good.
questions
Yes.
so they can be really clear about where are we headed with this discussion. And again, this discussion can't be the last 5 minutes of class. You have to really plan your curriculum as you're moving this way. So first of all, you structure the conversation. You encourage openness. If you have developed a community where your students are feeling safe and able to take a risk, then you've got what you want in that classroom. This is not a conversation that you can have the first 2 weeks in school.
Right, that takes some time.
It takes time to build this. This might be something that doesn't happen until December, when the students really feel comfortable with you and comfortable with their classmates. You have to read the room to find out how they're doing.
Well, and especially if you've only got them 50 minutes a day.
Absolutely.
In an elementary setting might be different, might be able to get there a little sooner.
Yes.
I think it's interesting from the student's point of view. They may find very safe and welcoming in your class, but when they go to period 5, not so much. So
That's
these
true.
poor kids have to adjust
That's
to the
exactly
tenor
right.
of each classroom, too.
That's
the
exactly
environment.
right. I mean, they become multiple personalities
Yes.
as they go through the day.
It's a good way of thinking about it.
And sometimes you can talk about a student and one teacher will say, "Oh my gosh, you can't even believe that person." And you say, "He's a doll in my class."
Yeah.
Because they are different people with,
Yes.
it's
well, they
the
connect
way they
differently,
respond.
and
Yes.
they connect differently to
So
different
that's something to
teachers.
think about. You need to model contributing and listening. It can't all be just from the teacher. This is, you're listening to them to learn also. You want to keep the conversation student-oriented. This is not where the teacher says, "Well, I believe," or "I think." That's not your job there in this kind of a conversation. And you have to get comfortable with silence, which is one of the most difficult
hard
things
for
for a
us.
teacher.
That's very hard for us.
30
The wait
seconds
time.
of silence, we need to just jump in and encourage them to start talking. And we'll say,
30 seconds, 10 seconds.
Exactly. It's like, come
Dead
on,
air.
somebody has to say something.
Right.
So-and-so, what do you have to contribute? This is not the time to
Yes.
do that.
Yes.
And then you have to check in and support your students. That's one of the things about seeing their faces, that you can tell how they are responding. Some students may be really emotionally tied to what you're saying, and you have to be aware of that because you may have struck a chord that you didn't know you were going to hit. And so you have to deal with strong emotions. And what are you going to do? And this is such a critical piece because you don't want to send them out of your class without having dealt with this topic.
Yeah,
If
but
some-
Sandy, the bell rings. They
I-
gotta go.
I know that is absolutely true, but that might be the time where if you see somebody who is really struggling, you call that student aside before they walk out the door and ask what you can do to help. How can I help you with this? You can always write a pass to the teacher in the next class if you need to debrief with that student and try to help them deal with the emotion that they've had. But it's very important. It's also important because sometimes these conversations in the classroom can get expressed in more aggressive ways out on the field.
True.
And so you have to be aware of some of those
True.
pitfalls also. But then you need to wrap up the conversation, which means that you have to be very strategic in how you've had this conversation so you have time at the end of the class to actually debrief. You want to summarize what you've learned. You want to revisit the goal. Why are we having this conversation? You want to share the appreciation for people who have learned or shared, and you want to identify shared experiences. Maybe you can say, well, Jim and Joe, you had the same reaction to this particular thing, and identify that so the students know that you were really listening. And can this conversation lead to more discussion or perhaps even a future action plan? When Michael was talking about taking action, this might be a possibility where the next class that you have, you can talk about, well, we raised this issue yesterday. What are ways that we can solve or approach this problem today?
Yes. That's a whole nother way of doing things that have to be very strategic, and very
Absolutely.
carefully
And
planned
that's why the
outlined.
ethnic studies program is so critical, because it wants you to be very deliberate and strategic in your
Yes.
planning.
Yes.
This is not just read the materials and answer
Oh,
the
no.
questions at the
No,
end
you
of
got to
the.
be prepared for this.
Yes.
It's important.
And then you need time and space to debrief. How are the kids going to write how they feel? Are they going to have a journal? Like,
That
I
works.
thought this was a rotten class, I hate it. Let them write that. That is okay if that's how they felt. Maybe you want them to do an art project or draw a picture of how they were feeling. Or maybe you want them to write you and give you anonymous feedback so they don't feel judged.
Right.
Like, Miss Line, I didn't like what we did today, and this is why I didn't like it. It's always good to hear that from your students, because sometimes you don't get that read from just reading their faces, but they felt it very personally and they want to respond to you.
Yes.
So you need that time for
Yes.
feedback and debrief. This is an excellent tool that has been created by our colleague Barbara Doughton on what you can use to evaluate what you have done in the classroom in developing these questions and these discussions, and what are your next steps. Every teacher needs to reflect on every class that they have had. What could go better? What should I change the next time I try this? What did I learn? And this is a wonderful tool to do that kind of reflection.
And we could find that tool here.
Oh,
in
yes,
the-
it is. It is
Yes,
absolutely.
that's
It's
available.
it's connected to the teacher guide.
Good.
So those are some ideas on dealing with
I love
difficult classroom questions. But the caveat to all teachers is you have to be ready for it and you have to plan for it. It can't be just, today we're going to discuss racial identity. That doesn't work.
Yeah. A lot of prep, and it takes a lot of practice too.
Oh, it does.
You know,
It absolutely does.
These are, I think, one of the most challenging things to do in a classroom. We can deliver content, but when you get into these sensitive areas, the how is as important as the what. And I think, thank you for sharing these tools. I think they'll be really useful.
Okay.
And ethnic studies is going to bring forth a lot of sensitivity issues, topics you may or may not want to approach, depending on your kids, where they're at. In the civic engagement work that many of us do, civic learning work, there's a lot of other great techniques. We have video on our LACO website that shows what does it look like when you're doing a Socratic seminar. That's a wonderful
excellent.
step-by-step guide. Structured academic controversy. We mentioned this in another module, where you have kids in groups of 4, and they're reading different narratives about a topic. Don't pick the narrative that you agree with, but each pair needs to read something and then share what they saw. Philosophical chairs. There's some really good techniques and ways to do that. We see these very common because you're right. You just don't walk in one day and say, all right, we're going to talk about abortion today.
Yeah.
No.
That's right.
They'll be frustrated, you'll be frustrated, and you're not going to want to ever do it again.
Right.
So creating that environment takes time. It's got to be safe, because in the end, you want those conversations to occur and to be civil and respectful. And sadly, we're not seeing that modeled so much in the general political landscape, but that's our goal, is to see if we can create it for the next generation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The thing about ethnic studies, too, is that culturally meaningful curriculum will help students engage in critical conversations about race, and this will have a positive impact on their engagement in education and their achievement. Research shows that ethnic studies helps foster cross-cultural understanding among students of color and white students, and aids students in valuing their own cultural identity while appreciating the differences around them.
And that comes right out of our ethnic studies model curriculum.
Yes, it does.
Which serves as our guide, adopted by the State Board of Education. That's why we take this document to heart as we move forward with this work. So
And
it's very important.
the real bonus here of ethnic studies is that as students get to know each other,
Yes.
and learn about each other and appreciate the gifts that everybody brings, we will have a much happier society, and a society that values everyone,
I think
which is
so.
our goal.
That's our goal, absolutely. All right, so thank you for part 3. Part 4 is going to be a lot of fun, Sandy.
Oh, yes,
Yes,
yes.
tell us what that's, tell
Well,
our
that's
audience
going
what
to be
that's about.
talking to your colleagues, to your adults, other adults.
You mean we all don't agree on all of this?
This becomes
Sandy?
a real
Really, even in
hot-
our own school?
really a hot button item.
Yes, it
And
is.
we as adults don't like to be uncomfortable. And so frequently we will sidestep a difficult conversation, which is not what we should be doing.
Even during staff meetings?
Especially during staff meetings.
Well, that'll be good too. We'll get some good tips, really, because
Okay.
we got to figure out how to do this with each other if we're going to do it with our students.
Absolutely.
Yes. All right. So we're looking forward to part 4, where we really get into it and helping us have similar difficult conversations with our own colleagues at our school site. Maybe it's even family members or community members, so that we can continue this good work and feel good about our working environment and
Yes.
home environment too.
Right.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Looking forward to part 4.